This is Kat Klingesmith with Retro Crime. We just passed the 109th anniversary of this crime, the murder of Lee Ritz by Jack Nolte. It happened on December 2nd, 1916 in Wheeling, West Virginia. The apartment building it happened in front of is still there. Jason and I went to see it, and a lot of Wheeling looks pretty much the same as it did 100 plus years ago. But the main difference is that there wasn't asphalt. So this murder took place on top of cobblestone instead. It's these details to remember when I'm trying to picture it. Jack Nolte killed Lee Ritz. Jack's court case was about something considered so vile, so taboo. It was like a Shakespearean work of innuendos in order to get around having to directly talk about it. Oh no, it wasn't about rape or prostitution. No, back then, rape was called ravishing, and a prostitute was a woman of ill repute or a woman of ill fame. Lawyers and journalists were primarily men, and they had no issue talking about these things. But for Jack Nolte's murder case, all the boys were ordered to leave the courtroom along with anyone considered to have tender ears. Oh, not because of the murder part, but because the defendant was an unapologetic homosexual. Jack Nolte was a 31-year-old brass worker, and his boyfriend was Lee Ritz, a 21-year-old senior at Wheeling High School. They had been together for 3 years, and Lee had recently become a local superstar as the team captain and running back for Wheeling High School. In the fall of 1916, under his leadership, they were undefeated for the first time ever. Lee got this opportunity because the former captain died the season prior from a head injury sustained during a game. Football became massive after World War I because it was part of the military's training program for physical fitness. The sport was so dangerous that when Lee turned 18, he made a will leaving property he inherited from his father to his mother. Jack signed it as a witness. Lee was a great high school student, a superstar athlete. He was on the debate team, and he was in a social club that serves the community. Cornell, 500 miles away, noticed this boy in Appalachia in a town of 70,000, and they offered him a scholarship to come over there and play football. Lee would have graduated at 22 years old, which happens when kids deal with tragedy early in life. Obviously, it wasn't academically related. His dad died when he was 4, and his mom moved around and stayed with relatives until she remarried, only about a year and a half later. These things can set educational development back while the child adjusts. I don't know how his dad died, but from clues, probably tuberculosis. He was about 24 years old, and it was rampant in the region when he died, which was 1899. Tuberculosis was especially deadly to young adults. They called it the romantic disease. The slow progress of the disease also allowed Lee's dad to get his finances in order in the final month of his life, which included the property he left for Lee. Lee was gifted, no doubt, but Jack wasn't a nobody. His father was a foreman at the newspaper and friends with the owner, good man to have in your corner. Jack worked at a brass foundry, and he even secured a patent while working there. When Lee was 21 years old, Jack moved to the West Coast, and while gone, he sent Lee a letter or postcard every day. Meanwhile, the separation was helping Lee because Lee was now becoming ready to move on in life. He was offered a bright future 2 states over and ready to be a smaller fish in a bigger pond. In Wheeling, he was the most celebrated man in town. He had just had a Thanksgiving Day win against their arch rivals of Bel Air, Ohio. He wanted more in life. Jack, he was now in the rearview mirror. Then Jack learned that Lee was going to Cornell. He returned to Wheeling immediately and called him. Lee's mom answered the phone, and when she told Lee it was Jack, Lee looked miserable and said, "Now everything is spoiled." Jack begged Lee to stay and asked everyone they knew to convince Lee not to go to Cornell on grounds of Jack not being able to stand being apart. The last day they were together was December 2nd, 1916. Jack went to Lee's house early in the day and they left together. In the middle of the day, Lee had to ditch him for a date with a girl. So Jack drank in a local tavern owned by one of Lee's relatives. He even begged that relative to talk Lee out of going to Cornell. When Lee returned, they walked to their usual place in Martins Ferry for dinner. On the walk back from the restaurant, Lee told Jack that he was going to Cornell and that they had to separate. Jack couldn't handle being dumped. He begged Lee to put it off for a month, for his sake. Lee said, "No, it has to be now." Jack repeated, perhaps warned, that he couldn't stand to be apart and asked, "Are you going home with me tonight, kid, or am I going with you?" Lee replied, "Neither, Jack. We are going to quit right now." Jack gave Lee a cigar and they continued walking in silence. It was a long walk from Martins Ferry to Wheeling, and Lee said, "Let's hurry up." In response, Jack pulled out a gun and shot Lee in the chest. Lee cried out, "Won't you let me live?" and slumped over. As he was slumped, Jack shot Lee in the back, which blew up part of his heart. Then Jack shot himself twice and fell on top of Lee. It was 9:30 p.m., and residents in the apartments heard the gunshots and saw everything that happened. The janitor from the apartments ran over, took the gun, and called the police. A woman who witnessed this claimed that someone took what looks like letters out of Lee's coat pocket. The police arrived, discovered that Jack was still alive, and rushed him to the hospital. At first, the police were stumped by the motive. They assumed it was jealousy and that both had been trying to woo the same girl. The police, I guess, had not met Jack yet. Then the town accused their rival football team of killing him because they were angry about losing the Thanksgiving Day game. Even back then, people took high school football seriously in small towns. Jack came back from what should have been a certain death and confessed to the murder-suicide attempt. When he recovered, he was escorted to jail. Jack was charged with first-degree murder because he obviously planned it since he'd borrowed a gun and brought it on their date. As much as they wanted to preserve Lee's reputation, and they tried, there is no way the court could ignore the big, gay elephant in the room, especially because the letters found on Lee were the ones Jack wrote while he was on the West Coast. The jury got an earful of what I did not read these letters. They were public record. I didn't read them because by the reaction, it was gay erotica. I wondered why Lee brought the letters, and I thought, why would I? Maybe for closure. He was moving on, didn't want them, didn't need them, but he cared about Jack and didn't want Jack worrying about them winding up in the wrong hands. Maybe he was going to return them when he said goodbye. Since Jack was going with not guilty, the defense had a pretty hard time. The first argument they came up with was suggesting that this was self-defense. That was disproven really quickly. In fact, Lee's body was found with the cigar still lit in his dominant hand. So they kept looking, and the only argument left to try had only been used once before in the history of U.S. courts. The alienists came in and said that Jack was crazy because homosexuality is a mental illness and he can't help it because God made him that way. Homosexuality was considered an illness, but I think it was in the 70s they finally took it out of the DSM. They brought Jack to the witness stand to explain himself. He wasn't rattled in the slightest. In fact, he was incredibly calm, and he described in detail his intense physical relationship with Lee, their last date together, and that he felt better ever since killing him, like a huge weight had been lifted. He said he no longer had to worry about Lee going to Cornell and being apart from him. He also said that he didn't feel bad about what he did and that Lee was better off where he was. The jury was asked to have compassion on the poor man being afflicted with such a terrible mental illness of homosexuality. They did have compassion. Instead of being given the death penalty, Jack was sentenced to life in prison, and he surprised the courtroom by cheering, clearly overjoyed with his sentence. I get it. He was single. There would be lots of fatherless young men in good shape. During the next few years, he ran the musical theater program at the Moundsville prison. Suddenly, in 1922, without any kind of appeal or warning, Jack was given a full pardon by the governor. People were confused and angry. Governor Morgan, he had also pardoned a bank robber who then got himself arrested in Pennsylvania for robbing a bank right after he was released. Jack's pardon caused outrage. The loudest protester was the prosecution for his trial. It was District Attorney McKee, who, in a previous episode, was the one who was outsmarted by a woman who killed her husband. McKee wrote a scathing editorial condemning the release of Jack Nolte, not because Jack was a murderer, but because he was a homosexual. He accused Jack of being a part of a gang of fellow sex perverts who hang out in a salon with the most depraved. These days, those places we recognize by their rainbow flags, and they often have women on the dance floor appreciating not being hit on all night by drunk men. Yes, there were gay bars in Wheeling over 100 years ago. There is so much focus on Jack's homosexuality and the moral judgments against him for it, that what they kept overlooking is that Jack wasn't the bad guy because he was gay. Of course not. He was the bad guy because he may be the most evil person I have done an episode on yet. His relationship with Lee was exploitative. He met a fatherless, sexually fluid teenager when Jack would have been in his late 20s at the time, and it never progressed to a mutually respectful partnership. He never loved Lee. He loved using him. He loved the power over him. I mean, geez, he referred to him as kid and asked whose place they should go back to. In the 1910s, calling someone kid or kiddo was popular slang, and it meant the same thing that it means now and is used in the exact same context. Maybe a kid on my son's baseball team has a big hit. I say, good job, kid. My husband, he's younger than I am. When he comes home from work, I don't say, hey, kid, what do you want for dinner? That would be pretty creepy. I'll humanize Jack here because he didn't create the monster in him, but he did feed him. His parents had 5 girls and 1 son. I imagine that Jack wasn't the boy they expected him to be. He grew up being gay in the early 20th century in West Virginia, where homosexuality was illegal and harshly penalized. It was seen as a moral failing, and if we look at election records, we can see that not much has changed. Jack was treated his whole life by the society around him that he was morally perverted. An innocent child who grows up being told that their existence is immoral, then where do they find the line? When someone's entire being is rejected, they can't develop healthy attachments or self-worth. We are born needing acceptance and self-esteem from our primary caretakers. And if we don't get that, we become dependent on outside sources to supply it. That's what Lee was to Jack. Lee was his supply to meet these needs. The result is someone flirty, manipulative, and clingy. They mistake desire and neediness for love. Of course, that's not love. Love is giving and requires a healthy degree of sacrifice. People like Jack are takers. And even if they give, it's with a selfish motive. Most of us, if we receive too much without giving some back, we feel kind of choked. And if not choked, at least a desire to give back for the sake of having balance. Not the Jacks in the world. They're selfish, self-absorbed, and self-centered. They're black holes who take so much, it's a wonder that they don't implode from their own misery. They self-medicate with addictions, and the most overlooked addiction of all is addiction to quote-unquote love. The beginning of a relationship releases so much dopamine that one can get addicted to another person. The alienness was close. Jack was crazy, but not because he was gay. He was crazy because of how he was treated his entire life for being gay. Except that's hardly an excuse for his behavior when there have always been plenty of same-sex relationships in bigoted societies, and we would have noticed if they all ended in murder-suicide attempts. It's ironic that Lee became a victim when he was proving to be a survivor. While impressionable when he met Jack, he gained self-esteem by doing things of high esteem. Jack's neediness disguised love. It was getting harder to manipulate Lee. And just like most high school relationships, they usually end when one of them goes off to college. Lee was acting normally. There's a romantic notion here that Jack thought that they could be together forever. Bang, 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 bang. Well, maybe. That's giving a guy who views his boyfriend as a possession a lot of credit. I think it's more likely that Jack was fine being apart so long as he still had a stronghold on Lee. But he knew that going to Cornell meant a life where working-class Jack didn't belong. That stripped Jack of his power, and his ego couldn't handle that. Shooting himself, well, that was a coward's way out of consequences. If Lee had to be apart from him, then it would be on Jack's terms. And it must have been a relief to kill the object of his obsession. The way someone feels relief when they can't stop eating something in front of them, and their server arrives, and they say, "Phew, please take this away from me. I can't stop eating it." Except Lee wasn't an oversized piece of carrot cake. He was a kid I would have been proud to call my own. His whole city was proud of him, and his future was so bright, then snuffed out by a man who was called godless until he turned evil. Evil doesn't always look like Ted Bundy. It's generally much more subtle. An evil person has a conscience and willfully chooses against it, then quiets their conscience with blame and justifications. They make decisions out of cowardice or self-interest, regardless of how many lives are destroyed. We're all guilty of this to some degree. The goal is to make decisions out of what's best for everyone. Most of us don't get this right in every aspect of our lives, but we get it right in some. To our credit, most of us don't murder people. Those who do generally don't do so in a place where people can see and be traumatized. At no point in any of this has Jack shown to consider anyone but himself. Then he was rewarded by going to his own version of Cornell, maybe more like Ithaca College, and then being released while still young enough to use more people and try to destroy a few more lives. What happened after he left was he quickly got married. He married a nurse from Wheeling, and they got married in Detroit, Michigan. Their marriage didn't last long enough to be more than a blip in the records. She lived a long life, and he was her only spouse, so I imagine that at some point she had been his nurse. He could see she was insecure with a big heart, so he manipulated her with flattery because he couldn't afford to leave Wheeling. He had to because he was hated and not welcome anymore. Detroit was probably along their route west. He did say he was moving back west after leaving prison. He disappeared after that, but she settled down in San Diego and lived a long life. I have a theory that that's where he wound up too. Reason being, the Navy had been growing there significantly for the past 20 years by this point, and with mass quantities of men come gay bars. When I visited San Diego in the 90s, I noticed that all the gay bars seemed to be named after tools, and I didn't understand why, and then I later found out it's because they're metaphors for male body parts. There is a psychiatrist, Dr. M. Scott Peck, who believes that evil is a mental illness and is treated as such. It's something to think about. Understanding someone's behavior and excusing it, they aren't the same thing. It looks like most of us have both good and evil within us, and I think we basically live like the Cherokee story of two wolves. A grandfather says to his grandson that there are two wolves inside of him fighting, one that does good and one that causes harm. His grandson asked which one wins. Grandfather replied, "The one I feed." Thank you for joining me. The next episode, I am trying to find a great seasonal one for the holidays, and that will be our last episode.